Hey everyone, so obviously the recent reveals about Roger and Rox have gotten everyone really excited, and there's one point in particular that a lot of people have really latched onto, which is that Roger teamed up with Garp to take down the Rox pirates. So combine that with the recent reveal that Kobe has been, working his way up the ranks to Rear Admiral and has become a special agent of Sword, and now we've got a lot of discussions going around about how Kobe is Luffy's modern day Garp. And of course, there's still some others swinging back and saying that no, Smoker is still supposed to be Luffy's Garp. So now feels like a good point for me to address an issue that I think the One Piece fanbase has in general, which is this desire to try and manufacture parallels between the older generation and the newer generation that don't really exist. Now, I'm not saying that One Piece doesn't have parallels between the past and the present. There are obviously plenty of parallels, and of course, a major theme of the story is how the past often repeats itself. If you keep up with my analysis videos at all, you know how much I like to talk about these sort of connections. Literally, in my recent Wano arc analysis, I spend a good portion of it early on talking about parallels. But here's the distinction. There's a difference between observing a large number of uncannily specific similarities between two characters and concluding that the author is drawing a clear parallel between the two, versus simply learning about a character from the past and then deciding that there should be a modern day parallel, and then trying to find someone in the current story that fits. Now, the second way is something that I feel like a lot of the One Piece community does, and it's definitely what I would call a forced parallel. And I know right now plenty of you who already have your headcanon planned out of how Luffy and Kobe are one day going to beat Blackbeard together at Raftel are typing away about how I don't get to just decide what is or isn't a forced parallel. So please at least wait till the end of the video before trashing me. I am going to ultimately get to Kobe and Smoker. But first, I'll go through some other examples so you guys can try to understand my reasoning, and then if you disagree with me in the end, maybe you have an argument I didn't consider that you can definitely tell me about in the comments below. And for the record, I totally understand the appeal of parallels. People like seeing things in stories that connect or loop back to previous ideas, but at the same time, I think it's important to recognize the areas where Luffy's story is unique and distinct from Roger's, and we shouldn't just try to force more similarities that don't exist in an effort to turn Luffy's story into a carbon copy of Roger's. So to start with, before addressing forced parallels, I think it makes sense to talk about natural, legitimate parallels so I can better explain the difference as I see it. So to start with, I think we can all agree that there are some parallels that are so freaking obvious and intuitive that there's not even any point in discussing it. For instance, Luffy and Roger. I would have to go through and paste dozens and dozens and dozens of panels from the entire series to cover how clear and deliberate that parallel is. It's the reason people say, this character is Luffy's Garp, or this character is Luffy's Whitebeard. They are looking for even more ways for Luffy's story to parallel Roger's story by trying to find a matching cast of characters. Now, nothing is going to be as clear-cut as Luffy and Roger, but the point is that there are parallels that are so clearly intentional that they don't cause any debate. So going down that route, how about the other big parallel readers took away from that Roger and Rox story? Rox and Blackbeard. Now this one, there's a small chance that we're all jumping the gun because we only have one chapter of information about Rox's nature. But why is it that there's not really any debate going on as to who Luffy's Rox is, the way there's so much divide over who Luffy's Whitebeard or Luffy's Garp is? Like, the simple fact that this parallel feels so clear and obvious and intentional that everyone has accepted it off just one chapter of information should be a big indicator of what a natural parallel feels like as opposed to a forced parallel. And if we want to pick apart the specific reasons we all intuitively made the connection between Rox and Blackbeard, the fact is that there's a large amount of uncannily specific similarities. Rox and Blackbeard are the only two evil Ds that we know of in the entire series. Rox was Roger's greatest pirate enemy, just as Blackbeard seems set to be Luffy's greatest pirate enemy. Rox wanted to conquer the world, just as Blackbeard wants to conquer the world. Rox began his pirate fleet on Fullerlet Island, which Blackbeard has also made the base of his pirate fleet. And if it couldn't get any more obvious, Blackbeard's ship name is literally the Saber of Zebek. And to be clear, I'm saying it's the fact that there's a large amount of specific similarities that make this a clear, deliberate parallel by the author. I wouldn't take any one of these similarities alone and say that it makes for a definite parallel between these two characters. It's the fact that it's all this stuff together that makes it safe to say that Oda intends for the reader to see a parallel between the two characters. So along that trend, another parallel that the vast majority of readers seem to accept is Zoro and Rayleigh. Now, this is not nearly as strong as Blackbeard and Rox, but there is certainly enough there that it seems clear that it's Oda's intent for the reader to recognize a soft parallel between Zoro and Rayleigh. Of course, they're both the first mates of the Pirate King's crews, as in literally the first recruits. And of course, Rayleigh was the vice captain, which many characters, at least in the universe, view as Zoro's position, though this is of course unofficial. Now again, with just that alone, I wouldn't say that Rayleigh and Zoro meant to clearly parallel each other the same way that, Crocus and Chopper aren't parallels just by virtue of being Roger and Luffy's doctors. Just being Luffy's first mate doesn't automatically make you a parallel of Roger's first mate. The question is whether Oda wants us to think of these two characters in a similar light. So, personality-wise, they seem vaguely similar, but not remarkably so. They both seem to be level-headed and kind of serious, though Zoro seems to be much more serious and is a lot stupider on average. They both like to drink, but Zoro's like a legitimate alcoholic, and then Rayleigh is interested in women and has a good sense of navigation, which is nothing like Zoro. So vaguely similar in personality, but again, not that much on its own. But now something a bit stronger is Rayleigh fights with a sword. And using a sword isn't rare in One Piece, but it is rare to be a top-tier fighter with no devil fruit and just a sword. So for the former Pirate King's first mate to have been a top-tier fighter with no devil fruit and just a sword does feel somewhat what we can expect of Zoro. And then Rayleigh more clearly is the dynamic they had with the respective Pirate Kings. Most first mates and their captains are kind of just a straightforward boss and subordinate situation. And then there are rare cases of father and son or mother and son, but Rayleigh was referred to as Roger's partner, which is a much rarer dynamic in the series. And this certainly fits Luffy and Zoro's relationship, as they are frequently portrayed as a sort of dynamic duo, something that even other characters point out. And lastly, the thing that really tips the scales to yes, there's definitely an intentional parallel between Zoro and Rayleigh, is the scar over the eye, in my opinion. That's a very striking, very specific character design choice, and what's interesting is all of Oda's drafts of post-time skip Zoro included some sort of a scar around his eye, so that was a choice that was always important to him. So basically, Zoro and Rayleigh is probably the softer end of parallels you can have, but at the end of the day, there are enough specific similarities that make it clear that this is intentional by the author. Again, any one of those similarities on their own is not enough, in my opinion. Shanks has a scar over his eye just like Zoro, but nobody thinks that Zoro parallels Shanks because we all realize that there needs to be more to it than that. So hopefully you see what I mean about intentional parallels. If you're going off just one thing like, oh, Rox was Roger's greatest pirate rival, so Blackbeard is the same as Rox, that's not enough to claim that the author is trying to parallel these characters. Oda clearly does more than that when he wants us to think of a certain character and what they are to Luffy's story in the same light as what another character was to Roger's story. So keeping that in mind, let's talk about forced parallels. We'll get to Kobe and Smoker at the end, but first I want to talk about who is Luffy's Whitebeard. So for a long time, people would say that Law is Luffy's Whitebeard, and I think that started to die down, but I still see it occasionally. And this is an excellent example of a forced parallel because you can just tell it's purely based on a desire for Luffy to have a Whitebeard rather than any sort of substantial similarities. And some people took it a step further and said that Luffy, Law, and Kid are supposed to be the modern day equivalents of Roger, Whitebeard, and Shiki. Look, so we could all see that Oda was pushing this dynamic of Luffy, Law, and Kid as being the most important rising rookies, but because we could see this dynamic, people tried to manufacture an equivalent dynamic in Roger's era despite the fact that we knew next to nothing about Roger's era or Roger's story. And for a long time, the only big pirate name we knew of from Roger's era was Whitebeard, until Shiki got introduced so that a movie could be made, and that's it, that's all the fan base needed. Boom, we know 3 pirate names from back then, so alright, Luffy can be Roger, and Luffy and Law are friends, so now that makes Law Whitebeard, and Shiki is kind of mean, so that makes him Kid. Like, do you see what I'm saying? And I'll get to Law and Whitebeard in a second, but the Kid-Shiki thing really confused me because from the start it seemed clear that Kid was the supernova being given the most focus out of all the Sabaody rookies, and seemed the most similar nature to Luffy, meaning it would be a fair guess to say that out of all of Luffy's supernova rivals, Kid was meant to be the most significant, and that's something that Oda himself acknowledged. On the other hand, we had pretty much no context as to how important Shiki was to Roger's story. As far as we could tell, he was a one-time nuisance to Roger, and that was that. And he certainly wasn't portrayed to be as important of a figure as someone like Whitebeard. But because Shiki was the only other name from the previous era that we knew of, and he happened to have an antagonistic relationship to Roger, people decided that that makes Shiki the predecessor to Kid. Never mind the fact that there were plenty of other pirates back in the day that were antagonistic to Roger that had simply yet to be named. Just because we learned a little bit about one doesn't mean that Oda's trying to say that this character parallels Kid. That's just people being thirsty for parallels. If anything, we just learned that Shiki, while a notable pirate, wasn't even one of the biggest names of the era. And even just relationship-wise, Shiki wanted Roger to join him to rule the world together, whereas Kid and Luffy's relationship is clearly purely competitive. And that brings us back to Law and Whitebeard, because I think Shiki and Kid would never have even been brought up if people didn't decide that Law was the equivalent of Whitebeard first. So how did people land on the Law and Whitebeard parallel? Well, Roger was friendly with Whitebeard. Luffy has become friends with Law. That's it. That's literally it. All it took was Luffy becoming friends with one other pirate captain for people to conclude that guy is Luffy's Whitebeard. That's not a parallel. If Luffy's first pirate ally had been X-Drake, I guarantee people would be calling X-Drake the new Whitebeard. Is there anything else besides being another pirate who the Pirate King befriends that suggests Oda is drawing a parallel between Law and Whitebeard? Like, if anything, I'm hard-pressed to think of two good guy characters who could be any more different. Whitebeard is this sort of larger-than-life embodiment of kindness, spirit, and willpower. He is kind of the ultimate man, the ultimate warrior. He was really the big good of the entire One Piece world up until Marineford. This is a guy that would go around putting entire islands under his protection, taking in all the lost children of the sea as his sons, and who was an unstoppable and unyielding figure in battle, never retreating or backing down from anything. Law is also a good guy at heart, but that's where any similarities end. Law's not some saintly figure trying to save people he doesn't know. Law's not some benevolent protector of the weak. Law isn't some lion-hearted macho warrior. He's a cunning pragmatist who's not afraid to run when necessary, and honestly, as good as he is as a fighter, his greatest strength is as a tactician and strategist. That was how he planned to take down Doflamingo at the end of the day, through strategy rather than actual combat. So at the most basic level, the characters are almost nothing alike. Now on top of that, their dynamics with the respective Pirate King are also almost nothing alike. Now I'm only going off the little information we had regarding Roger and Whitebeard's dynamic, but from what we know, it sounds like these two were equals and both at the top of the pirate food chain. Oda has not at all been portraying Luffy and Law as equals, and I'm not saying that to trash Law or anything, that's just a fact that's very apparent if you reread. And I'm not just talking about strength. I think most everyone would agree that Luffy is stronger than Law, maybe even a lot stronger at this point, but I'm saying that Oda has not portrayed Law as being Luffy's equal in an even broader sense. When Luffy and Law are together, Law gets pushed around. From the moment they started their alliance, that's been the way it is. Luffy's will supersedes Law's every time. Luffy gets his way every time. They follow Law's plan until Luffy decides they're not doing that anymore. And even from the start, Law had to be warned that he had no idea that he's dealing with someone who's already on Emperor-level stubbornness. Law does not know how out of his depth he is dealing with someone like Luffy. Luffy's belief that he can beat all four Emperors is something that Law can't even comprehend, and Law's first instinct when dealing with an Emperor is not to fight, but to retreat and regroup. And if you're thinking, well, that's just because Luffy is Luffy. Oda never writes anyone as keeping up with Luffy in that regard. Well, no. Look at how Oda portrays Luffy and Kid's dynamic. Unlike Law, Kid is a character that actually brings out Luffy's competitive fire in a way we've seen very rarely in the series so far. Just being in the same room, their wills clash. Stuff like who carried more stone blocks isn't really the point, of course. It's the general portrayal that this is someone of Luffy's caliber. Someone who is stubborn and strong-spirited in a way that Luffy clearly is. And of course, this fits the fact that Kid is a Conqueror's Haki user as well. And everything we hear of Kid, that he has in fact challenged 3 of the 4 Emperors already, and even when one of them landed in front of him, he immediately chose to take him on. That's the kind of character that's the closest thing we could say to being Luffy's spiritual equal out of all of his rivals. And guess what? I'm not even trying to say that Kid is Luffy's Whitebeard. I don't think that either. I think there's a lot more similarities we would have to see before concluding that Oda is trying to make Kid out to be Luffy's Whitebeard. I'm just using Kid as an example to highlight how little sense it makes to argue that Law's role in the story is to be the Pirate King's one true equal. Law is very clearly not written in the same style as those characters with this larger-than-life, supreme king spirit. He's just not a Luffy or a Roger or a Whitebeard in that sense. And again, for the record, I'm not trying to trash Law's character. Law is a great character for other reasons. He's smart, he's logical, he's realistic, he's perceptive, he's cunning, and all of the stuff that makes him a great foil to Luffy, and a really great character to have in One Piece, but he can be a unique character with a unique role in the story without being Luffy's Whitebeard. That's just not how he's being written. And what's interesting to me is that as much as people said Law was Luffy's Whitebeard, people were so ready to jump ship when Katakuri showed up. Suddenly, Katakuri's Luffy's new Whitebeard. Maybe Katakuri showing up made everyone realize how poor of a fit Law was because a slightly better fit showed up. That in itself suggests to me that people are just assuming that there should be a modern day Whitebeard for Luffy and are just, trying out different candidates to see what vaguely fits closest, which again is forcing a parallel. And look, maybe Oda is developing Katakuri to be Luffy's Whitebeard. Here we can tick off a few more boxes in similarities. He's a mostly good pirate who sort of befriends Luffy, but he is also much more similar as a character to Whitebeard than someone like Law. He had an evenly matched fight with Luffy like Whitebeard did with Roger. So right now I'd say sure, maybe Katakuri will play a role to Luffy like Whitebeard did to Roger, but that's it. Maybe he will. At the moment, we have zero indication that Katakuri's journey is going to be continuing forward in the story, or that he will be playing a major role in the future. At least Law and Kid are being written as extremely relevant figures in the story of One Piece going forward, and are on a clear trajectory upwards in the pirate world along with Luffy. Whereas we have yet to have any indication that Katakuri is meant to be anything more than a significant gatekeeper for Luffy to get to the next level. So to already be saying that Katakuri is Luffy's Whitebeard is just making up a parallel that you want to be true, because you want Katakuri to be Luffy's Whitebeard, even though there hasn't been any hint that he's going to continue to have any sort of dynamic with Luffy. Again, it's possible, maybe his story arc continues and he becomes Luffy's equal, at the top of the food chain. Maybe he becomes the modern day Whitebeard to Luffy's Roger, but unless we actually see Oda start developing that dynamic, you're just assuming that Katakuri will one day fill that role because you assume it's a role that needs to be filled. So now finally, let's get to Smoker, Kobe, and Garp. So here's something I admit, I thought it was possible at one point pre-time skip that Smoker was being written in a sort of Garp role to Luffy. Here there were actually a decent amount of similarities. Smoker and Garp are both Marines who had a very singular focus on catching the would-be Pirate King. Both of them cornered the would-be Pirate King multiple times, with him narrowly escaping each time. Both of them began to develop a sort of friendship or respect with the future Pirate King. Neither of them care about their rank, but are more concerned with having enough autonomy to accomplish what they care about. Neither of them seem to respect the authority of those above them. They're both stubborn and choose to do as they please. To me, that was a lot of similarities that cumulatively made for a pretty similar dynamic with the respective Pirate Kings. However, at the same time, there were a lot of differences. In all other aspects of their personality, they are totally different, and really that's because, as silly as it sounds, Garp's clearest parallel is Luffy himself. Garp is simply Luffy if Luffy had been a Marine and was a bit more mature. And that's why Garp was, from the start, the hero of the Marines. He was the champion of the Marines, because naturally Luffy as a Marine would have been the ultimate Marine who was always hunting the ultimate pirate. So when I think about it now, I was trying to force a parallel. It doesn't really make sense for Luffy to have a modern-day equivalent to Garp, because he's more similar to Garp than anyone else. Basically, the modern-day Garp is actually a pirate, and we're already following his story. There's no one like Garp in the Marines today, besides Garp himself. And so this is what I mean by the trap of assuming that Luffy is supposed to have the exact same cast of characters and relationships in his story as Roger did. Some characters are simply unique to Roger's story. If Luffy was meant to have a Whitebeard or a Garp, we wouldn't be having about all this debate about who that is. It would just be intuitive. We wouldn't be debating and working to fit a parallel. So sure, Smoker doesn't respect authority like Garp and likes to do things his own way like Garp, but at the end of the day, when I think of Smoker and I think of Garp, they feel like two very different characters. And just because Oda wanted to write a Marine who is a consistent figure in Luffy's story and who can help maybe show us the better side of the Marines, that doesn't mean we have to shoehorn him into the role of being Luffy's Garp, because it's very likely that Oda has an entirely unique character arc for Smoker that doesn't have to be in this box of being Luffy's Garp. And it's weird because now we're at this point where it's become clear that Smoker is too weak to be called Luffy's Garp. And it's somehow turned into this criticism towards Oda as though he's failed to properly develop Smoker into the Garp role, a parallel that Oda never really pushed himself, but one that we as readers tried to pigeonhole Smoker into. And since now most people have abandoned Smoker as Luffy's Garp, finally we can talk about the new Garp, Kobe. It's just the strangest thing. For the longest time, Smoker was Luffy's Garp, and there was a small minority that was saying that Kobe might be Luffy's Garp. Now it's become clear that Smoker isn't strong enough, but hey, we saw Kobe stop that torpedo and he just got promoted to Rear Admiral. Alright, let's say that he's Luffy's Garp. That right there should be the tip-off. The fact that the logic was Smoker's too weak to be Garp, we have to pick somebody else. That in itself is proof that we as the community are trying to force a parallel, because that logic is purely based on the assumption that Luffy is supposed to have a Garp. It's like people are assuming that we have to basically recast all the same characters from Roger's story into Luffy's story, and it's like, okay, who's going to play Whitebeard's part? Who's going to play Garp's part? Like, there's this role that people think is supposed to be filled, and we've picked an okay candidate, Smoker, but when he doesn't seem right, we cross him off the board and go back to the drawing board and pick the next best thing, Kobe, and now try to force him to fit that role for a while. Again, I've seen a lot of people saying that by the end of the story, Kobe should be teaming up with Luffy to take down Blackbeard or something, basically randomly shoehorning Kobe into a role simply because it has to be the same as Roger's story, and we have to find somebody to fit the role of Garp. Like, come on, can we actually talk about what Kobe's character is like for the moment? Like, is his entire story building towards some sort of endgame team-up with Luffy to take down Blackbeard? Because as I see it so far, Kobe's most important character moments come from the fact that he is not strong. In fact, I think that is the point of his character. At the start of the series, Kobe is like us, the average reader. We all have our own dreams, but the vast majority lack the guts to give it their all and pursue it. And so Kobe's first moment is showing that anyone can have the courage to pursue their dream, that even if you are the weakest person in the world, what matters first is having the conviction to chase your dream. And of course, that conviction is rewarded. And his next moment is similar. He is helpless and hostage, but it doesn't matter if he is weak. He doesn't fear death, and again, his bravery is rewarded. When it comes to protecting his friend, is Kobe actually capable of stopping anyone? No, he's too weak, but his willingness to do so despite his weakness makes a difference again. And after this, of course, Kobe gets stronger, strong enough to continue to be relevant in the story, but at the end of the day, his biggest moment in the series matters specifically because he is still extremely weak in the grand scheme of things. Even though Kobe is a weak, nameless Marine, he shows that it doesn't matter how small you are, you can still stand up and say that something is wrong when you see it. No matter how insignificant you are, you can make a difference. And that has always just been Kobe's thing. He's weak, but despite his weakness, he's able to stand up and make a difference. Do I expect his final role in the story to be as some sort of unstoppable Marine powerhouse? No. That's what people want him to be because people want Luffy to have a Garp and people have decided Smoker isn't it. I wouldn't expect Kobe to be this top-tier fighter by the final war for the same reason that I wouldn't expect Usopp to be a top-tier fighter by the final war. That's just completely inconsistent with what Oda is trying to show through these characters. And obviously Kobe's going to become an admiral someday. I would assume in some sort of epilogue. After all, it's the fact that Kobe does what he does despite being weak that gives him the potential to one day be extremely strong. But at the moment, everything about the way Oda has written Kobe's character so far suggests to me that whatever ultimate moment he has in mind for Kobe would not feature Kobe, the strongest Marine in the world, taking down Blackbeard, but rather Kobe, a Marine who is able to make a difference despite not being the strongest. Yes, we are all excited about Kobe's torpedo feat and him being part of a fleet to capture Hancock and him becoming a rear admiral, but to me that just seems like Oda has moved him up to the necessary level that he would still be relevant and active in the story, and a level that the reader can feel happy seeing his progress at, rather than an indication that Kobe is going to jump up to Garp level over the next couple hundred chapters. The bottom line is, if there isn't an obvious modern-day parallel to an older generation character, then don't force it. Don't assume that there's supposed to be one. If anything, what's interesting is thinking about what makes Luffy's story different than Roger's, and why that might mean he has a different cast of characters. For instance, Roger's story was not about defeating the world government, whereas Luffy's story likely is. As such, while the strongest Marine of Roger's era happened to be his friend, it makes total sense that the strongest Marine of Luffy's era is an enemy. And in my opinion, if you're really looking for a fitting Marine enemy for the Pirate King, why not the guy that killed his brother, who scarred him for life, who has sworn to hunt him down and kill him, and who Luffy clearly holds a grudge against as well? I think people need to let go of this need for Luffy to have a friendly, equal rival in the Marines, when the point is that today there is no good guy Garp at the top of the Marines' food chain. It's a different era, different story, with a different ending. And if you don't think Luffy is going to fight Akainu, that's fine. This video is not about that. My point is just that the nature of the Marines today is very, very markedly different than back in Roger's era for a reason. And if you want Luffy to have some ultimate opponent in the Marines, then why try to force Smoker or poor Kobe into that role? So that's all for this video. If you enjoyed, then definitely like, share, and subscribe. And you can join my Patreon for chapter reviews and Extended Thoughts podcast. Talk to you all next week.